Everyone on this bright Sydney Saturday morning, and I have with me today Ally Coll from the Purple Campaign, all the way from Washington, late in the afternoon for her. Welcome, Ally.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's really quite an interesting time to be discussing what we're going to be talking about today. The Purple Campaign is a Washington-based non-profit which has been set up to advocate for changes in legislation and policies and procedures around workplace conduct, particularly harassment, bullying, and sexual harassment. Ally, before we get into that, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So, I come at this issue from the perspective of both a lawyer and as a young woman who's experienced workplace harassment myself. In fact, my very first exposure to this issue was in my very first job, which was as an 18-year-old intern on Capitol Hill. And I was sexually harassed by the senator who I was interning for, who was a very powerful member of Congress at the time. And what I learned from that experience was that his behavior was really an open secret in Washington, and that I was really encouraged to, just move on from the experience and not make a big deal out of it. And I didn't end up choosing to report it through formal channels because people, it became clear to me that the issue wasn't that people were lacking information that I could provide. Everybody had the information, they knew about his behavior. The problem was he was a very powerful senator and I was an 18-year-old intern, and nobody was really interested in challenging his behavior. So, I was lucky enough that I was in a temporary job and I was able to mostly just put the incident behind me and went on to have a great career in politics and then in law. But when the Me Too movement went viral in the fall of 2017, I started reflecting on my own experiences. This one immediately came to mind, and I subsequently learned that even if I had reported the misconduct through formal channels at the time, I actually wasn't protected under existing law as an intern because the legal system in Congress only applied to paid staffers. And so that really motivated me to recognize that there was this global awareness being raised about a problem that I myself had experienced, not just in that one job, but again, over and over in my career, and that I knew so many others were also dealing with. But as a lawyer and as a former Hill staffer and policymaker, I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a moment of awareness raising, but one that resulted in actual written down changes to the rules, both in terms of internal workplace policies and also in terms of public policy. So that's what motivated me to be here doing the work that I'm doing today.
So I just want to touch, before we move on to what the campaign's now doing, a little bit personally. I mean, like all women, it happens, it's across the scale, it doesn't matter where you work. When those things, the Me Too movement started to happen, bringing back memories for you, somebody who is trained as a lawyer, to be precise and forensic around issues, was it traumatic?
I think for me, I feel fortunate that the experiences that I had were, I think they were damaging in the mindset they put me in, which was, this is business as usual. This is what you should expect as a young woman in the workplace. And that being in my very first job, I think it set me up for a mindset in which I didn't really challenge these behaviors that then, as you're saying, I went on to get my law degree and learned, really learned, this is not just uncomfortable, this is illegal. And I think it took me years and an education that not a lot of people are privileged enough to have to really understand how egregious the misconduct was and how much I had a right to speak up against it. Those were not things that I feel I was well trained on or well talked about. And the other thing I recognize, and I now know this more through the work that I do than my own personal experience, is that so often the process of reporting can be more traumatic than the incident itself. We just did an event last week around this theme of institutional betrayal and, what happens when you trust your organization enough to report it and they don't do right by you. And I think I feel fortunate that, because I didn't report it, I didn't go through the experience of having that mishandled, which I think is so common of an experience and really makes it all the more traumatic. I actually experienced that a little bit more in my law firm when I learned about some of the tactics that my firm was using as lawyers, not so much in my own personal harassment experience, but I did feel, a sense of institutional betrayal with my firm when I felt like their values weren't really reflecting mine. So that's a long way of saying, yes, I think there's a lot of trauma involved. I think my own experience has been nuanced in that way, and that I've kind of had these piecemeal experiences together. But I'm really motivated to do the work that I do because I hear so many stories of people who have gone through much worse than I have, and I felt that I was in a position to try to help make things better for them.
Yeah. So the law firm that you worked for had a connection to Harvey Weinstein, is that correct? How did that all unfold? Because we're isolated here in Australia.
Yeah, so as the news started to trickle out about Harvey Weinstein, newspapers started reporting the fact that my law firm and the chairman of my firm, David Boies, was representing Weinstein and had been, and the Weinstein Company. And so both him in a personal capacity and also the organization for a long time. And I learned about this first from the press. I started getting text messages from friends and family saying, like, what do you think about the news about your law firm? And I didn't know what they were talking about until I Googled it. And so that was the initial news. And I will say, as a lawyer, especially in corporate law, we represent people and organizations accused of misdemeanors and wrongdoing all the time. That's our job. And so the fact that Harvey Weinstein was a client, or the fact that the Weinstein Company was a client, did not in of itself cause a huge moral dilemma to me. I think lawyers defend people accused of murder and rape, and that's a part of the job. But a couple weeks later, another story broke in the New Yorker that exposed the fact that our firm had retained private intelligence officers to spy on the women who were coming forward with their stories about Weinstein to the New York Times. And they had lied to them and misrepresented who they were. In fact, in one case, one of the agents pretended to be a women's rights activist and reached out to the actress Rose McGowan and befriended her by asking her to be a keynote speaker at a women's rights conference they were organizing. They exchanged phone numbers, and she would text her things like, I'm so proud of you for speaking up, and et cetera, et cetera. And I had just told my own Me Too story. I just shared it publicly, the story I referenced earlier from my time in Congress. I had just shared that with the Washington Post, and I had gone on the record when I did that, and it was a very scary thing to do. And so when this news came out, about the tactics my firm had used to try to intimidate women out of doing that, it really hit me on a very core level, because I could imagine, what if some of these people who reached out to me after my article came out and said, thank you for speaking up, I'm proud of you. I got a lot of messages like that. And all of a sudden it occurred to me in a way I'd never thought of before. What if those people aren't who they're purporting to be? What if they're, not the allies that I think that they are? And I think knowing how scary it was to put myself out there and how hard that was, and thinking that there were people like at my law firm who were trying to intimidate and scare people out of doing that, I just had a very visceral reaction to that, and it was very personal to me.
And did you take steps? I think I'm reading in some background on you. You actually spoke up about, was it the ethics around all of that, or trying to help the organizer understand that they could do it a different way?
Yeah, so, fortunately I was not alone in feeling this way. I think it was an experience that was a little bit more personal to me because I had just spoken up about my own story, but there were a lot of like-minded colleagues at my firm who were similarly disappointed in the firm's actions. And so I spent about 2 months at the firm working with other associates and with the firm's leadership to try to bridge the gap a little bit and have some conversations around, why the firm's actions were so problematic, especially to me and many of my peers. I think there is a huge generational divide, at least in the United States, around this issue. And so there was a lot of work that we were doing just to kind of bridge that gap and explain what was happening with the social movement and why it was so problematic for so many people that the firm was involved in this way. So we did, and the firm did, to their credit, make a number of important changes, but they did not go as far as I was hoping they would go. And there were things that I felt unresolved about that ultimately prompted me to leave. But I also was motivated to leave because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I saw an opening to create change around this issue, and I felt uniquely positioned to do that work. And so it was something I just felt extremely motivated to do and kind of called to do. And so it was a combination of all of those things that prompted me ultimately to leave and start the Purple campaign.
So that's a really good segue. Where did the idea for the Purple campaign come from? Was it from deciding that I need to do something about that? And what does Purple stand for in all of this?
Yeah, so the idea came about from a combination of my experience in Congress and my experience in my firm, which was that after I spoke up about my experience on the Hill, I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't really have very high expectations of Congress. As a former Hill staffer, I was a little cynical about their ability to get things done, but almost immediately legislation was passed in a bipartisan fashion to completely overhaul the system on the Hill, to do things like protect interns like myself, to change fundamentally a lot of really broken elements of that system. And I was really moved by that. And I was moved to see Republicans and Democrats and women and men really speaking up about this issue in a way that I had never seen before. And then at the same time at my workplace, even though there were things that I wanted to see being done that I didn't feel were ultimately done, there was a huge recognition from people in leadership that they needed to respond to this moment too with changes to our internal workplace policies and practices. So they promoted more women to the firm's executive committee. They formed pro bono partnerships with advocacy groups in this space. And I recognized that there was a willingness from leaders, both in the workplace and in government, to respond to this moment with change. And so I wanted to create an organization that would advocate for specific policy measures, much like we have in the United States, organizations that do that work around abortion rights or do that work around gun control. There wasn't really an existing organization that I saw that was well suited to jump on this moment and push lawmakers and push employers to put in place particular policies. We picked the name of the Purple campaign for two reasons. Purple has been a historic color of the women's movement here in the United States, and this is obviously an issue that affects all genders and gender identities, but it does disproportionately affect women, and it creates really significant barriers to women's economic participation and opportunity, and that is a huge motivating factor of our work. And the other reason is that purple is a unity color, both in terms of politics and red and blue, but also, we believe that a really diverse coalition of stakeholders was needed to come together to create change. And a lot of, as I mentioned, my inspiration and hopefulness about this moment was seeing people who disagree on almost everything else coming together and agreeing that something needed to be done about this.
So what have you achieved so far? I mean, you're a young organisation and no doubt funding's been an issue and, getting started and getting supporters. I know you were recently an advisor on a very special film, is that correct?
Yeah, so I had the chance to advise on the biopic film On the Basis of Sex, which was a film about Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's early legal career and her days at Harvard Law School, which is my alma mater. And so that was a really a huge honor. Her early career mirrors mine in some ways in that she also, entered the legal profession, saw all these barriers to her own career advancement. She couldn't get a job that she should have been able to get because of her gender. And she was now educated with these tools to recognize that that should be illegal. And so she, instead of going the sort of traditional law firm route, started the Women's Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union. And that organization still exists today and is still doing litigating work to fight for women's rights in the judicial system. So that was a really fun project for me and personal, as she's kind of one of my heroes. We also were really fortunate that she was an early supporter of the Purple campaign. She joined our founders circle and donated funding to help us get off the ground. So it was a huge honor to me as well to know that she believed in and supported our work, and motivates me now every day to get up and do my best work in her legacy and in her memory. And other things we've accomplished, you know, I will say I'm proud of the change that we have been able to effect. On the congressional front, that bill that I mentioned that was introduced in 2018, immediately in response, is called the Congressional Accountability Reform Act. It took a lot of work to get that passed. Both chambers of Congress did introduce bills pretty quickly, but it took a long time to reconcile the two versions. And even though there was a lot of bipartisan support, there were a lot of sticking points. And so in our first year, we focused a lot on that bill. We organized online action campaigns, and I spent a lot of time you know, advocating for specific policy reforms, and both chambers of Congress did ultimately unanimously pass legislation at the end of 2018 that went into effect last year. And so now workers in Congress have a whole new set of protections that didn't exist when I was a staffer there, that I think, and they really did, to their credit, comprehensively overhaul their policies in a way that not only serves the workers on the Hill better, but I think can serve as a model for other government workplaces as well, and how to do this right. And then on the corporate front, you know, we've been fortunate to get a corporate coalition of about 20 different companies from across industries. We have large multinational corporations like Amazon and General Electric. We have law firms and tech companies like Airbnb and Uber at the table. And so we've been able to bring together a table of employers who really can affect a lot of change, and have been working with them to develop a corporate certification program, which will be a way to recognize employers who are taking recommended steps in the workplace to address this issue. And the idea behind that is to give both consumers and also employees and people in the talent market better information about which companies are taking this issue seriously, so that they can spend their dollars wisely, and so that they can choose places to work that will, you know, be good work environments for them, and therefore hopefully incentivize other employers to rise to that bar too, because they want to be competitive in the market.
So you've got a really narrow niche, but a really important niche. So your intention is to chip away at the laws one at a time. Is that my understanding, or?
Yeah, I mean, we're taking a two-pronged approach. One is on the public policy front, and there are legal changes happening both to federal law and also in the states. So we're monitoring all of that. And then there's the sort of voluntary piece that employers can do. And one thing that I became very hopeful about in this moment was that we were seeing employers choose to go above and beyond what the law required them to do. And so that's really the goal of our certification program, is to create, as a third-party organization, a new set of shared norms and expectations that, you know, you may be required in California to do one thing and required in New York to do another, but these companies are operating in all 50 states, and they're operating around the world, and they have a chance to have a bigger influence than that. And so really working with them on, what does your employee handbook say? How are you training your employees? And, you know, kind of trying to get the issue from that angle as well.
Have any employers come to you when they've been engulfed in a scandal themselves to say, okay, how do we manage this properly? What do we do?
You know, most of the work that we've been doing has been with companies who I think are really committed to getting this issue right before that happens. I think that one of the reasons that I wanted to start the Purple campaign is that there was so much focus in the Me Too movement around bad actors and these scandals, and they were dominating the headlines, stories about people like Harvey Weinstein. And no doubt, you know, those stories are important levers for change, and we need them to come out and for people to be held accountable for their mistakes. But I also was at the same time learning about all these companies and corporate leaders, many of which are a part of our coalition, who were doing wonderful things and really choosing to go above and beyond what was required of them and innovating and thinking outside the box. And I wanted to find a way to lift up those stories and to say, not just don't be like Harvey Weinstein, but be like Airbnb, which is one of our corporate partners. Their general counsel had personally gone around the world and trained all of the company's employees in small group settings with a very innovative training that he had developed himself and put a lot of thought into. So how can I lift him up as a male ally and somebody to emulate, right? Like not just in a bad example, but a good example too. So that's been more of our focus, has been on kind of some of the positive features and trying to share those best practices with others.
You're talking about Rob Chestnut?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm talking to him later. So
good.
how amazing. Yeah. And the thing that struck me, the linkage, because I didn't realize, the connection between the two organizations until I looked a bit further. But the thing that strikes me when companies go above, it's the spirit of the law, isn't it? It's, what is the right thing to do? And rather than what can we get away with? That's what I've been reflecting upon, because those people who genuinely care about anyone being harassed in the workplace want to see it stopped, don't they? It doesn't matter what you've got. It's a moral and it's an ethical issue, and laws should be in place to protect people, but it's not the be all and end all. It comes down to behavior.
Yeah, Rob was one of the very first leaders that we connected with in the corporate space, and I was so inspired by what he was doing, and I'm grateful that he was in support of the work that we were trying to do, and that partnership really helped us bring in other companies as well. So Rob is exactly the type of person who I was looking to say, there are Harvey Weinsteins in the world, but there are also Rob Chestnuts, and let's try to, all move toward a world where more companies are following his lead.
Yeah, one of the concerns I have, and I'll be really interested to hear, have you identified it as an issue and are you working on it? One of the concerns we have as first responders sitting with people who've been the subject of workplace harassment or workplace bullying is the state of their mental health. And by the end of the internal processes they are put through, very often, they're in a terrible place. And it concerns me that a lot of bad actor organisations don't have in place proactive policies that mental health support is immediately given. Is that something that you've identified, that needs working on?
Absolutely. I think this is a huge component of the issue. First of all, we know that workplace harassment, there's a lot of research that shows it has very serious effects on mental health and physical health. It also can increase the risk of workplace accidents because people are distracted and they're, not focused on what they're meant to be doing in the job. And then, the process of reporting can be very traumatic and take additional tolls. And I think not only is that problematic from just a mental health perspective, but also from an economic opportunity perspective, their job performance suffers when they're, going through something traumatic. And I don't think employers have traditionally been as understanding of that. And, they'll sort of write up a performance review of somebody without taking into account that maybe their performance is suffering because they've experienced illegal and traumatic conduct in the workplace. So one of the things that we're doing in our certification program is we've asked companies in our benchmarking research about the extent to which they have support for employees, not only in terms of providing them with mental health resources. We ask about whether they provide those in-house or whether they do it through referral to a third party. We also ask about to what extent they provide employees with other wellness initiatives like meditation or yoga practices. And then also another trend that is emerging that I'm hopeful about that we're hoping to spread is more of a role for an internal employee advocate. I think there's been a recognition that historically in the United States, at least, when a company is looking into a case of harassment, the people doing that, they're really there to look out for the company at the end of the day. And so the employee often doesn't have an advocate and doesn't have somebody who is tasked with keeping them updated about the status of their investigation or checking in to make sure they know, what the process looks like from here. And Microsoft is actually an example of a good company where in response to some, bad press, but to their credit, they did create a whole new system where every employee who reports misconduct is assigned an advocate whose job it is to just shepherd them through the process, to make sure they understand, what the next steps are, to make sure they're receiving timely updates. The other thing we ask companies a lot about is, are you taking steps to protect employees during the investigation? Like, are you offering remote work options? Are you making sure they're not being forced to work alongside the harasser while you sort out what the appropriate corrective action is to take? So yes, I think it's a really important part of this and something that we traditionally haven't done very well at addressing and that we're hoping to, codify in our certification criteria.
I know you're concentrating on, if you like, reform and getting it right. But in Australia, for example, we're starting to see advocates in spaces like domestic and family violence linking the behaviours of workplace harassers or perpetrators and workplace bullying because they're the same behaviours, which comes down to a bigger issue about how we actually conduct ourselves as human beings. Are you doing any work in that space, or you've just kept it purely in what happens in the workplace environment?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think actually the pandemic has brought this issue to the surface like never before, because this distinction between work and home is dissolving before our very eyes. And I think employers are recognizing, we've seen a spike in domestic violence instances around the world with, lockdowns and people quarantined with violent partners. And that is affecting their work in a way that it didn't used to, because people can't, go to the office and they can't leave what's happening at home anymore. And so I think we have been working with some policy organizations that do work more in the gender-based violence and domestic violence space to think about how can employers better support their employees who are maybe facing these issues, whether it's being more accommodating about leave or the ability to access pay if people need additional money to be able to get out of a bad situation. So I think, our primary focus has been on what's happening in the workplace, but as what is the workplace has kind of changed over the last 6 months, that's really changed the nature of the way we were thinking about these issues too.
It's very interesting. When we chose a name for our chaplaincy, we called it WOW Chaplaincy, and people don't often know what that means. And the WOW is actually world of work, because the International Labour Organization said a couple of years ago that the world of work is changing. It's no longer a physical place, which the pandemic has more than magnified for all of us, that work doesn't have a place or a border anymore. And that's the issue around abusive behaviour, because perpetrators can impersonate an individual via email. They can do all sorts of extraordinary things to lose someone's job. So we're actually getting to a situation that we've got to think about from a policy point of view, which is almost impossible to legislate. What do we do? And again, it comes down to what you're talking about, is working with proactive organisations that perhaps have a code of ethics that embed how they actually want to walk the talk and to raise, it's predominantly women, but it does affect other groups around harassment, what they can do to support them. Are you talking about within the program, the accreditation program, some sort of ethics program, or you're not going there?
Yeah, no, I think, there's so much to be learned from what companies have done around reporting and handling other forms of workplace misconduct, especially I think financial misconduct is an area where I see a lot of parallels. We've done a better job at rooting out and creating whistleblower protections and systems for reporting embezzlement, for example, than we have with harassment. But I think there's no reason that a lot of those same policies and practices can't be applied to this space to create more robust response and reporting systems. So yeah, we're asking a lot around companies' practices for handling other ethical issues as a part of the idea that we can integrate those better and not treat sexual harassment as such a siloed issue. The other thing that's really integral to our work is, I really think that workplace harassment is an intersectional problem that needs to be viewed through a multidimensional lens. And, we know, for example, that women of color are not only more likely to be targets of harassment, but they're also less likely to be believed when they come forward to report because of implicit bias. And so we kind of came to this issue through sexual harassment because that's been my personal experience, and that was also what was really the focus of the Me Too movement. But I believe strongly that the same policies and practices that can be used to root out sexual harassment can and must be used to root out harassment on the basis of race or discrimination on the basis of religion or disability. So we're definitely looking to use this, window we have with companies that are interested in addressing sexual harassment to create generally more equitable workplaces, and that requires tackling a whole set of issues that go well beyond sexual harassment.
So what a big job. It's certainly not 9 to 5. How do you look after yourself, Ally? Well, your own self-care. I mean, you can't do this work unless you're functioning.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's been a huge learning curve for me. I went from a job where I was asked to track my time in 6-minute increments on the billable hour at a law firm to being my own boss and doing work that I feel so passionately about and that is so personal to me is both extremely motivating and also very draining at times, especially when there are constant news cycles that are bringing up issues that that are pertain to my work and also pertain to my own human rights. And I think it's become really important for me to understand that self-care is a form of doing the work, that I need to show up as my best self. And if I'm going to show up as my best self to do this work, I also have to rest. I have to be very regimented about my news intake, for example, especially here in 2020, where it feels like every time you look at what's happening in the world, there's another horror to absorb. So I have become extremely disciplined in my routines, and my sleep has become extremely important to me. It's like the first thing to go when I get stressed is my sleep, and that snowballs from there. So I have a lot of practices. I get up at the same time every morning. I have an Ashtanga yoga practice that I do for 30 minutes first thing when I get up, and I do that before I look at my phone. And I have my own sort of schedule around how and when I check my news. I read the news in the morning. I check in at various points throughout the day as needed, but I do not sit on Twitter all day. I do not have the TV on all day. I would not get anything done, and my blood pressure would be constantly through the roof. So, I think everyone needs to find what works for them. It took me a while to figure out how to be my own boss, how to know, when to stop working and when to push myself to work when I didn't feel like working. But over time, I found that balance, and I think it's really a journey for everybody to figure out like what nourishes you and what allows you to keep doing the hard work. But it's important, and I do tell other people in this space, whether you're doing work that matters to you just as a volunteer or whether you're doing it full time like I am, you have to consider that if you want to be an effective advocate. It's an important part of it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Ally. We've really enjoyed the chat, and I hope you'll come back and give us an update on the Purple campaign. Maybe we'll see it in Australia, possibly.
Yeah, I would love that. Well, we're certainly trying to have an effect all around the world, so hope to be in Australia and other places as well.
Thanks, Ally.